Welcome to Nasdaq TradeTalks, where we meet with the top thought leaders and strategists in emerging technologies, digital assets, and regulatory landscape and capital markets. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, and joining me on the desk at the Nasdaq market site, we have Matt Fitzpatrick, CEO of Invisible Technologies, Dr. David Brumley, head of AI at Bugcrowd and professor in the electrical and computer engineering department at Carnegie Mellon University, and Professor Winston Ma, executive director at the Global Public Investment Funds Forum and adjunct professor on sovereign investors at the NYU School of Law. We're here to discuss where the gaps exist with enterprise AI adoption and how companies will make it work in 2026. It's great to have all of you with us. Welcome to Trade Talks, a good mix of academia and technology here. Matt, the AI hype cycle, where are we right now? We know companies are adopting this. There's widespread use across multiple industries. Is it hype or is it real?
Look, I think if you look at the technology progress, it's definitely real. I think there's been a step change improvement in the models over the last couple of years. I think if you look at consumer adoption, so 65% of consumers, according to a recent KPMG study, use AI on a weekly basis. The problem has been enterprise. I think that there's a recent MIT report that 5% of models make it to production. And so I think we're somewhere between any natural hype cycle. You have some disillusionment before you have improvement again. And the technology improvement has been real. You can debate where valuations go from here, but I think the technology improvement is very real.
Yeah, and David, why do you think that there are gaps within enterprise AI adoption?
Well, I think one of the big gaps is when you implement it, the question is what business purpose is it going to fulfill, and also how can you check the outputs of it? So there's been this hype cycle to see where it can fit right now. And as people are solidifying where it can fit, the next question they're going to ask is, how do we trust the output of that? And building the right organizational structure around that.
Yeah, and what do we do with all this data, right? There's a lot of unstructured data that's out there.
Sure. Yeah, I was a former Wall Street lawyer banker, right? So people tend to think, looking at the Nasdaq, they would think Wall Street has a lot of structured data and the data structure is already there. But in reality, we're dealing with a very messy data situation at the Wall Street. Think about decades of contracts, agreements, even side letters, and then in heavily regulated areas, you have email chains try to figure out what actually to implement those policies and the rules, right? And eventually, at the edge, you have conflicts of laws, and then you have all these actual case studies of how people implement these policies in real markets. So essentially, this is a gold mine for AI to go into the Wall Street and redesign the whole Wall Street transactions system.
Yeah, and David, I would argue regardless of what industry you're in, it's going to come down to data quality, right? Garbage in, garbage out. Governance, how are we securing this? How transparent is it? I think it doesn't matter if it's Wall Street, healthcare, manufacturing, all those principles are going to apply.
Yeah, garbage in, garbage out is a great way to put it. Where if you're asking it, well, it goes beyond that. If you're asking it the wrong question, you're going to get the wrong output. So it's not just data, it's are you using it for the right sorts of questions? And then the security is really critical on this. And it's not just the security of the LLMs themselves. People think about jailbreaking and things like that. It's making sure that when you're using it in your org that you're not running off a cliff as fast as you can.
Yeah, and then Matt, you also have to be mindful of not creating problems that don't exist, right? We understand the efficiencies that AI allows for, but where are you extracting the value is the critical question.
Yeah, look, I think to scale AI, you need three things. Clean data, which you talked about. You need line ownership and actually transforming the workflows you're going to go after. I think the most complicated one, though, is what I'd call verifier's law, which is you can only scale AI as far as you know it's accurate, and how accurate it is and where it is accurate. And that's, I think, been the hard thing. If you take like a legal document, like you were saying. If I generate let's say a 50-page legal document for an M&A agreement, I might have some idea where it's good or bad if I go through it. But then if I have to generate 1,000 of them, my ability to actually verify where it has issues is where a lot of the complexities arrive. And I think that's one of the reasons why, I think we were talking earlier, the benefits of people moving to more task-based or small language models on specific topics where if you take a specific, like the definition of collateral, you can train a model to do that pretty well. It's much harder to generate a 50-page legal document well.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting how confident it's incorrect. I think that's one of the hard parts, right?
Often wrong, never in doubt. Yeah, exactly.
I could really add on to this. I think by now, with all the LLM models out there, essentially commoditized, the small is the new big. Because for many enterprises, right, they do not need to go through this big model training process by themselves. Instead, a lot of models out there, some free open source, right? And based on that, using their own data and use their own fine tuning, they come up with small models specific for their specific needs.
Yeah.
I do think it's worth noting the concept of fine-tuning is not something I think most people are even aware is important. I think most people are hoping in an enterprise context you would just take a model and turn it on and it would work for all your use cases. And what you do have to do is fine-tune it and train it off of your very specific data. I think to your question on the cycle, we're in like the first inning of people realizing that. I think after 3 years of 5% of models 5% of models working, you're now seeing a much more focused desire from enterprise to actually work through that process, but it's taken some time.
But isn't it also down to security as well? I mean, your job is to protect data at the end of the day, right? So if you were to just put everything into an open source LLM, not only you're going to be training other models based on your data, but I mean, there's a lot of slippage there.
Absolutely. Look, I think a lot of the data that we're talking about is extremely proprietary. If you take a sector like banking or healthcare, like most of it has to stay on premise. They may not be comfortable putting it in the cloud. And so I think there's both the accuracy and quality of the data, the security of the data, the environment in which you store the data, and that journey also has taken a couple of years. I do think people have made progress on that, but look, when good AI meets bad data, the data wins. So you have to have the data ready to make any progress.
Yeah. I think it's one of those interesting things. What our customers are talking about is really the need for this human in the loop, not just to look at the quality, but to your point, to also understand like what's happening with the data. Like there's major foundational LLMs that are amazing, but then you have to really question, like, does this work with our business model because of what rights we may be giving away, and really understanding that.
Yeah. And I think for data security, we have to go to the Jensen Huang's concept of sovereign AI. Obviously, Jensen Huang came up with sovereign AI concept at a Middle East conference relating to like national cloud infrastructure. But the concept is much broader than that, because as we talk about data security, right, sovereign AI essentially is relevant to any enterprises that deals with data, sensitive data in a regulated industry, and worries about data sovereignty of any particular stakeholder. It could be individuals, could be corporations, it could be the nations, right? But we have to put this sovereign AI concept into enterprise application.
Yeah.
And that is part of why you are seeing, I mean, we train and fine tune a lot of the large language models, so we statistically validate them. We see how many countries now are actually requiring certain AI to sit like in their locations. They're not allowed, and I think that is going to be, I do think sovereign AI is a real thing. Yeah,
well, let's take a step back for a moment here. We have two professors sitting at the table.
Yes.
Is the skill set available, right? I don't think humans are going to be out of the loop. I think it would be very short-sighted to think that's the case, but it's not even just the technical skill set, but you have compliance and being able to understand the regulations and internal governance structure as well. Do you think we're there yet?
No, I mean, the rise of these LLMs have happened so fast that people are still wrestling with the basics. So you're right, there's the technical questions. How do I manage context? How do I prompt it in the right way? Is there prompt engineering? I think there's always going to be a human in the loop for important tasks. It's going to be about amplifying human ability. But to get the true benefit out of that, we have to figure out how to teach people how to use AI. And at universities, we're really scrounging fast to make this part of the curriculum because we just have to do it.
Yeah.
And we're still actually, quite honestly, figuring some of this out ourselves.
Yeah, because it's one thing to put direction into an AI platform and then get the answer out, but you have to be able to discern, okay, does this make sense? And then what about the logic behind it and being able to figure out the answers?
Precisely, yeah. So you could say at this moment, learning with AI is also biased. We're not talking about this bias of the models, but actually I'm talking about the different outcome, different benefits for different users. At this moment, it's mostly beneficial to the top thinkers, frankly, because if you're the best of that subject, you can make the best use of that AI to help you to become even better. And then if you're moderated better, you get an improvement. But if you are just entry level, actually you get very little out of that because you do not know the logic of the thinking behind the AI.
Well, what we're seeing with Winston actually is kind of interesting with some newer users, where if you teach them the basics of prompt, they're really using these things as almost like a TA or a teacher. And we see this not just in education, we see this in business too. Like, I don't know about this. Quickly, what is it? I have a meeting in 2 hours.
Yeah. Well, but this, you have this in your notes here as well, Matt, where enterprises are struggling, where that precision and the rigorous testing, and I understand the use cases for all the different AI tools that we have now. It could just think faster. The human isn't able to analyze all these data sets. It just helps you to put things in a more logical place.
Yeah, it does. I think here's the challenge. The definition of how you do the testing and what rubric you grade against is much less clear in Gen AI. So as an example, if you take a credit underwriting for a mortgage as an example, right? Like that's a very clear decision. You can back test, you can look at, I take 1,000 mortgage decisions, I look at what a human does, I look what an AI, an ML model does, and you get pretty comfortable that it makes an accurate decision. Again, if you take the legal document example, 50 pages, multiple documents, multiple clauses, the rubric of how to evaluate success has been harder. And so even though AI is able to parse through more information, it's the verifiability that is the challenge. And I think that's where you want to develop, for any use case, you need to develop a rubric and then figure out how to score that rubric statistically before you launch it. And that's what enterprises have been struggling with.
And one of the things I think you touched on, Matt, I'd be interested in your opinion on this, is part of what AI is doing is identifying bias and amplifying it, right? That's the whole insurance example. It's a statistical algorithm, right?
Yeah, I think in some ways, LLMs are trained off of the full corpus of all available information, and so in some cases when you only want to train them of a very specific task, you may be better off, and again, using a small language model where you don't expose it to the broad corpus of internet data, for example. And I do think that's why more and more we are seeing, particularly regulated entities, banks, insurers, move towards small language models that they can test and validate in certain use cases.
Yeah, I mean, especially at the end of the day, you know, you and I both coming from Wall Street, right?
Yes.
They're regulated industries.
Yes.
You can't get around that.
Yes, you know, actually, that's kind of human in the loop at the ultimate case, because you have to deal with the regulators, and it's changing, right? So, for example, at Nasdaq, we think about the capital markets regulated by the SEC, but it comes from like one provision of the Securities Act, 1933, and after that, you have decades of new interpretation from the SEC. That's keep evolving, right? And so, in the sense that it's not only the analysis you need the human in the loop. Actually, the data set that the AI works on is still relevant to the human evolution, right? Because human, like in this case, regulators are generating new contents, new rules for the AI to work on.
Yeah, and Matt, you brought up something before, you know, in terms of bias within the data sets. In your example before with getting approved for a mortgage, I mean, that's a classic example of an area where bias needs to be removed. You know, EEOC, right, employment law, it's not going to change, right, as it exists today, and whether it's a human or you know, an AI platform making those decisions, you still have to adhere to that framework.
Well, look, so I actually think one core belief I have is that AI is actually much better at guardrailing bias if you train it properly. So actually, if you take the mortgage example, every bank has to go through model risk management. They get audited for how did you come to a decision, what did you audit, what's the percentage of outcomes that relate to certain things that could indicate bias. And so actually, if you take a credit decision, having 1,000 people decide in a distributed way who gets a loan versus a central model, you actually get a much more unbiased model this way. The problem again with Gen AI though is you then need a framework to evaluate what bias you're trying to avoid. Is it language? Is it cultural bias? Is it, you know, there's 100 different frameworks for how a document is written and how text is written. And so I do think it all comes back to what is your objective function, what are you training for? And I think that's, if I say one failure in the enterprise I've seen in the last 3 or 4 years, it's that people just start building something without clarity on what their KPIs are and how they're going to evaluate what works and what doesn't. And they end up 3 years in with something that's kind of a Frankenstein of different objectives, but it doesn't solve the core risks and kind of outcomes they're trying to work for.
Right, so David, it sounds to me like for 2026 as we start to think about, okay, now we have to show ROI and what problems we are solving. How do you think enterprise is going to approach this? I mean, they've had almost 3.5 years to come up with that answer.
Well, what our customers are talking about is how do we add back in the human to do this verification, where before they might have moved too fast. And we're seeing this across the board in any enterprise, especially like in my particular area of computer security, to make sure that there's a human. Because as I said, the AI will be confidently wrong. And you just have to guard against that. So I think my bet is we're going to see enterprises starting to look at like how do we mitigate that sort of
Right, well, you also don't want to run the risk of not having enough redundancy. Right, there's been plenty of examples where you see how, you know, one of the cogs get loose and the whole system gets impacted.
Yeah, actually, that's where the KPI concept is very important. You know, surprisingly, people haven't thought about that concept for a long time because LM model concept is big, to go big, go scaling, and then try to be AGI, general intelligence. But in fact, the most kind of direct application, the easy kind of low-hanging fruit for AI application is in very specific use cases, right? So for example, in the financial areas, you can, in well-defined terms, you can see AI can work out a very efficient outcomes. And then in factories, like for example, in China, Huawei, those Chinese tech companies, they have developed this so-called factory brain. And you think about factory, it's a very constrained area with very repetitive work. And in those areas, AI plus robotics can figure out something, learning very quickly.
Right, but I don't think in general, Matt, that the fear of AI taking jobs has necessarily come to fruition. Jobs might have been lost, but perhaps it's more about right sizing and not AI taking everything away.
My view to date is that almost all of the numbers announced have not been related to AI. They've been results of other factors, overhiring the economy, et cetera. I mean, the rate of production, you can look by use case, there's just not enough of it to actually relate to most of them. And I think to the interesting thing, if you take the question on ROI you raised earlier, I think that one of the reasons you haven't seen enough of it yet is you have 1,000 proof of concepts working across an organization. And you have the classic power law distribution of that's not how you get ROI. You should pick 2 things that really move the needle and focus on them. And so I think there are some that are starting to contact centers, coding, and it will be more focused use cases, not 1,000 sub-use cases. And so that's what I think most enterprises I see making progress with this. Focus, have a line owner, have a clear ROI target, have a KPI, and then they're making progress.
Yeah, David, I wonder if there was such a rush for internal and external products to be pushed out, saying that you have an AI story, right? Are you seeing those gaps and vulnerabilities be exposed because there wasn't enough time to figure out, what your 2 best use cases are going to be?
Well, I think there's around that, especially when you look at coding software, the AI has created incredibly vulnerable software. And so you definitely need to be checking that.
So what's an example of that?
Oh, you ask the AI, I want to add this new functionality to my web app. I want to add like a new way to check out for shopping cart, maybe Apple integration. And it will add in a vulnerability that allows an attacker to steal merchandise, right? To buy stuff without paying.
Yeah.
Because it just generates the code, people field it, and they've never actually tested it. You need to add back in that human.
Well, and that goes back to, you don't necessarily going to wipe out your entire human workforce. I mean, you need developers and engineers and coders and testers and all that.
No, yes. So think about Wall Street, right? You have a top trader or you have a rainmaker investment banker, and you worry that if this key man walks out of the door, a lot of institutional memory, especially those related to your key clients, will disappear with that guy, right? So as we chat about, the Wall Street still deals with a very messy data infrastructure, with unstructured, structured data coexist, for many decades, and now still it's a very human-driven business. So actually AI is a very useful tool, but it's not going to replace a human to create this institutional memory layer, let's say, which keeps all your critical information in one place.
Yeah, so I wonder if part of it too is when you're thinking about ROI is how successfully you've integrated as well, Matt.
Oh, I think that's the vast majority of it. I think that if you take the classic model of, I'm going to give somebody in the IT department a Gen AI task and then have them transform, you mentioned insurance claims. It will never work, and it won't work because the insurance claim team has a line owner that has a way they run the process that is integrated with a bunch of really smart business people that know what they want to do, and so you end up with almost 2 separate, entirely different silos. And so the organization, I think here's an interesting fact: if you take the Y Combinator startup class of this year, last year, it has doubled the revenue of any class before it because you're building those businesses to natively integrate business and AI. But when you try and take an existing process and you say, IT team over here, figure it out, they don't make any progress because they don't integrate with the core business functions.
Yeah, and that's always been the challenge, operating in silos, right? So
Yes.
what's the point of this entire exercise if we're going to operate in silos again? All right, gentlemen, appreciate the insight. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks, and thanks for joining me from MarketSite. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.